Wolves circling a woman in the dark. That's what changed his life forever. Jonah Pike heard the snarls first. Then he raised his lantern and saw her cornered against a rock shelf, with the pack between her and his firelight, a burning branch in one hand and a knife in the other, 3 wolves closing in. Her name was Sika. She was White Mountain Apache, and she was alone, and she was not afraid. Not exactly, but she was about to die, and Jonah Pike was about to become something he hadn't been in a long time, needed. This is the story of a man who fought a wolf pack through the longest night of the winter of 1884, deep in the Arizona territory, to protect a woman he didn't know. And what her people did when they came to his gate afterward changed everything. Watch till the end to find out how it ended. And if you're new here, like and subscribe. Stories like this one go up every week. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The Tonto Basin in winter doesn't look like much from a distance. Just a broad, shallow bowl of country pressed between the Mogollon Rim to the north and the Sierra Ancha to the east. The kind of place that makes you feel small without particularly meaning to. The junipers hold their color even in January, dark green against whatever snow has fallen, and the creek bottoms fill with ice that groans at night when the temperature drops. It's country that rewards the patient and punishes the distracted, and Jonah Pike had been there long enough to know which kind of man he was. He was 31 years old. He'd come to the Basin 3 years before from a stretch of flatland country in Texas that he didn't talk about, and he'd built a small operation up against the foothills. 40 head of cattle, a one-room log cabin with a decent fireplace, a lean-to barn he'd reinforced the second winter after the first roof caved. He had a horse named Barlow, a blue-gray gelding with 1 white sock and a temper to match. He had a rifle and 2 revolvers, and enough salt pork and dried corn to keep himself going through March if the weather turned hard. He didn't have much else. That was the shape of it. His wife, Clara, had died in October of 1881, typhoid. She'd come down with it in the 3rd week of September and was gone before October ended, which felt to Jonah then, and still felt to him in 1884, like a cruel piece of arithmetic. 5 weeks. He'd had her for 4 years, and then he'd had her for 5 weeks, while she died, and then there was nothing. He'd come to the Basin because he needed somewhere that didn't hold any of her. That was the honest reason. Every road in Texas looked like a road she'd walked on. Every cook fire smelled like something she might have made. He'd needed new country, blank country, country that didn't already carry her shape in it. The Tonto Basin was about as blank as you could get in the Arizona territory, and so he'd come, and he'd stayed, and 3 years in he was still here, which meant something, though he couldn't have told you what. The winter of 1884 was hard. December had brought 2 feet of snow that packed down and froze, and January brought more on top of it. The creek was solid ice clear across. The cattle had pulled into a group in the low pasture, shoulder to shoulder the way cattle do when the cold gets serious, and Jonah had been hauling water from a spring hole half a mile away because the creek was locked. It was work, and it was lonely work, and most nights he sat by the fire and read the same 3 books he owned, until he'd memorized enough of them that reading them barely counted anymore. He'd heard wolves before that winter. They'd come down from the rim country when the deer got scarce, the way they did most hard winters, and he'd lost 1 calf to them in early December. He'd reinforced the lean-to. He kept a fire burning close to the cattle pen when the temperature fell hard. The night of the 16th of January was the coldest night yet. Jonah had gone out around 10 o'clock to check the cattle and bank up the fire in the tin barrel he kept near the pen. The moon was 3/4 full and the sky was clear, which meant the temperature had dropped fast once the sun went down. He figured it was somewhere around 15 degrees, cold enough that his breath came out in sheets. He heard them before he saw them. 4, maybe 5 wolves, working something over by the rock shelf that jutted out from the hillside east of the barn. The shelf was a natural windbreak, which was why he stored some of his firewood there, and it was also why whatever the wolves had cornered there couldn't get away. The rock closed off the back. The drop on either side was too steep to run. He picked up the rifle he'd carried out with him. He started toward the sound. What he saw stopped him for a moment. She was standing with her back against the rock face, a knife in one hand, a burning branch from what must have been a small trail fire in the other. The pack was about 12 feet out from her and moving. 3 wolves he could count, and likely one more in the dark behind them. They hadn't rushed her yet because of the fire, but the branch was burning down. She had maybe 3 minutes of flame left. She wasn't screaming, she wasn't crying. She was watching them the way a hunter watches quarry, tracking which one moved first, already working out which direction she'd cut when they came. Jonah raised the rifle and fired twice. The second shot connected. 1 wolf dropped. The pack scattered and the dark swallowed them. And Jonah stood in the moonlit snow with his ears ringing and the smoke of the shots hanging in the cold air, and looked at the woman against the rock shelf. She was looking back at him. She dropped into a crouch when the shots came, which was the right thing to do. Now she straightened slowly, the knife still in her hand, the branch still burning, watching him the way she'd been watching the wolves. He held up one hand, slow, palm out. She didn't move. He said, in as level a voice as he could manage, that the wolves might come back and that she ought to come inside. He didn't know if she spoke English. He wasn't sure what language he should be trying. He just kept his hand up and kept talking quiet, the way he'd talk to a spooked horse, and after a long moment, she put the knife away. She didn't put it in a sheath. She tucked it inside the front of her blanket coat, where she could get to it fast. He noticed that. Her name, he would learn, was Sika. She was White Mountain Apache of the Sika band, and she'd been traveling alone through the Basin on her way to a winter camp, where her people had gone ahead of her. Her horse had bolted from the wolf pack 3 miles back, and she'd been on foot since, which was how she'd gotten cornered. She was 22 years old. She didn't tell him most of this that first night. Most of it came out in pieces, over the days that followed, as her English and his handful of Apache words began to find each other. That first night she came inside his cabin and stood near the fire and didn't sit down for a long time. And he made coffee and set a cup on the table near her, without approaching her, and then stepped back and sat down himself. After a while she picked up the coffee. She kept the knife within reach of her right hand all night. He didn't take that personally. He understood it. A woman alone in a strange man's cabin in the dead of winter in the Arizona Territory had reasons for things like that, and a man who didn't understand those reasons wasn't worth much. Jonah Pike slept in the chair. She took the bunk. In the morning he woke stiff-necked and cold, and found her already up, the fire built back, a pot of water heating. She'd found the dried corn and the salt pork without being told where they were, which meant she'd been awake long enough to look through his stores. He'd expected that. He'd have done the same. He said, "Good morning." She looked at him a moment and then said, in English that was careful and accented and completely clear, that she owed him a debt. He said she didn't owe him anything. She said he was wrong. She said, flat and certain, the way someone says a thing that has already been decided, that her life belonged to him now until the debt was settled. That was the custom. It wasn't a question. He didn't know what to say to that. He'd never had anyone tell him his life had changed in quite that way, so directly and at breakfast, and he sat there for a moment not saying anything, and then he said that the least he could do was help her find her people's winter camp. She looked at him in a way he couldn't read, not hostile, not warm, assessing. She said that the snow would be 3 feet deep on the trail north of the Basin, and the horses wouldn't be able to cross it for at least 2 weeks. She said this without complaint. She was reporting a fact. He said she could stay. She said nothing. He said he had room and enough food, and she was welcome to stay until the trail opened. She looked at the fire. Then she looked at him. She said she would stay. The early days of it were uncomfortable in the way that shared close quarters with a stranger always is, but with the extra difficulty that they didn't share a language. Not really. She had English, enough to say most things she needed to say, and he had almost no Apache at all, which he was embarrassed about in a way that surprised him. She was patient about it. Correction's the wrong word. She didn't correct him, exactly. When he tried a word and got it wrong, she just said the right version and didn't make anything of it. The first time she laughed was on the 3rd day. He was trying to say the word for fire in ND, which is the White Mountain Apache people's own name for themselves, and he got it so wrong that she put her hand over her mouth and then, after a second, let the laugh out. It wasn't a polite laugh. It was a real one, sudden and genuine, and it changed her face entirely. He realized he'd been watching her face as a kind of weather gauge, reading it for signs. This was the first clear weather he'd gotten. He laughed, too. He'd been waiting for permission he hadn't known he needed. They fell into a kind of rhythm over those first days. She was not idle. She didn't sit by the fire and wait for the snow to melt. She started work on the day after the second morning, mending the elk-hide saddle cover he'd thrown in the corner, because he didn't know how to fix it. She used a bone awl she'd had in her pack, the way Apache women carry what they need, without making a production of it, and her stitches were small and tight, and better than anything he could have done. She asked him where his mending basket was. He said he didn't have one. She gave him a look that he would come to know well, a look that said she found him moderately remarkable in his helplessness, and she said nothing. He shoveled snow, he hauled water, he split wood and stacked it inside against the cold, and she sorted through his stores and reorganized them in a way that made no sense to him at first, and then turned out to be a way that made everything easier to find. She was good with the cattle. She had a way of moving among them that kept them calm, slow-stepping and quiet-handed, and twice she caught something he'd missed. Once a calf that had gotten its leg caught in a gap in the fence. Once a water trough that had cracked on the far side and was leaking. He said thank you both times. She said her father kept horses and that the first thing she had learned was to pay attention to what animals were doing. He asked about her father. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said her father was named Chato. She said this with the particular tone of a daughter who was proud and also slightly wary, and Jonah understood that too. Evenings were the time that stretched out longest. After supper, which they took to cooking together without deciding to, she would sometimes sit and work on something with her hands, small things, beadwork she'd had in her pack, a repair to her moccasins. He would read or mend tack, and the fire would settle, and the wind would lean against the cabin walls, and after a while the silence between them had stopped feeling like a wall and started feeling more like weather, the kind you just sit in. The 10th night, he'd been counting without knowing he was counting. She asked him about Clara. He hadn't said Clara's name out loud to anyone in almost a year. The question landed quietly, and he sat with it a moment before answering. He said his wife had died 3 years ago. Typhoid. She said she was sorry. He said thank you. She said her brother had died 2 winters before from a sickness that moved through the camp. She said he had been 18 and that she had taught him to ride. She said this without looking at him, which he understood. Some things you can only say to a fire. He said he was sorry too. They sat in the quiet for a while after that, and neither of them said anything, and it wasn't uncomfortable. The fire burned down some. Outside the wind shifted, and the cabin settled, and Jonah Pike thought for the first time in a long while that a room he was sitting in felt occupied. Not by one person alone in the dark. By 2. She'd stopped keeping the knife quite so close. He noticed. He didn't say so. On the 12th day, when she went out to check the cattle in the morning, he found himself listening for her footsteps coming back. And then he sat with that fact for a long moment and wasn't sure what to do with it. He started leaving her coffee before she was up, just the pot near the fire, ready. It was a small thing. She didn't say anything about it, but she started pouring it herself first thing when she came in from the morning cold, and she started letting it warm her hands for a moment before she did anything else. And he watched that small ritual and felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for 3 years. She taught him things. This is important because the story would be incomplete without it. It would be easy to tell a story like this and make him the giver, and her the given too, the rescued woman warming herself at the white man's fire. But that's not what happened, or not all of it. She taught him which juniper berries to crush into a paste for the wind-burned skin on his hands, which he'd been ignoring because he hadn't known there was anything to do about it. She taught him a White Mountain Apache method for reading the basin's weather by the way the clouds gathered above the rim in the late afternoon, a method that turned out to be more reliable than the way he'd been guessing. She showed him where a secondary spring was, maybe a 1/4 mile closer than the one he'd been hauling from, which he'd ridden past 100 times without noticing because it was disguised by a boulder overhang. She knew the country better than he did. She'd been through it every winter of her life, because her people moved between their summer and winter camps along routes her grandmother had known, and her grandmother's grandmother before that. He said once, just to say it, that he supposed she knew this country better than he ever would. She thought about that for a moment, then she said the country didn't belong to anyone, but she'd been listening to it longer. He didn't have anything to add to that. On the 16th day, her people came to the ridge. He was out near the barn when he saw them, 5 riders on the crest of the hill to the east, sitting still, watching. They weren't riding down, they were just looking. He felt the hairs on his arms come up inside his coat sleeve. He went inside. He told Sika there were riders on the east ridge. She went still for half a second and then crossed to the window and looked. Something moved in her face. Relief was part of it. He saw her shoulders drop about a quarter inch. She said they were her people. He asked if they were coming down. She said they would want to know she was safe. She said she would go out and speak to them. He said, "All right." She went out. He watched from the doorway because it seemed wrong to hide but also wrong to follow. She walked out into the snow without a coat, because she'd left her blanket coat on the peg by the door, and when she reached the clearing between the cabin and the fence, she stopped and raised one hand. 2 of the riders on the ridge lifted a hand in return. Then they turned and rode back over the crest, and were gone. She came back inside. She put her blanket coat back on. He asked what would happen now. She said they knew where she was. She said her father would come when the trails allowed. She said that until then she was staying. He said of course. She looked at him in that assessing way again. Then she said her father was going to want to know what kind of man he was. Jonah Pike said he supposed that was fair. She said it was more than fair. She said her father was the kind of man who formed an opinion and then held it, and she said it in a way that made clear she was both warning him and, in some small way, preparing him, like she was on his side already and didn't want him to walk into that meeting without knowing what it was. He thought about that after she went to bed. He sat by the dying fire and thought about a White Mountain Apache man named Chato coming to his gate in the thawing weeks of late winter. And he thought about what kind of man he was going to be when that happened, whether he'd be the kind worth being. He hadn't thought about something like that in 3 years. In the 3rd week, she stopped sleeping on the bunk and moved to the chair when he wasn't using it, which meant he could sleep in the bunk again, which was a strange intimacy. The way the chair still held the shape of her when he came in the morning. He didn't say anything about that either. She found a way to braid something using juniper bark and dried grass that turned out to be a small repair for the leather strap on the harness he'd been making do with since it cracked in November. He'd told her about the harness on the 9th or 10th day, and by the 23rd she'd fixed it without telling him she was going to, just left it repaired on the fence post by the barn. He came back from the cattle and stood looking at it for a long while. He went inside and said thank you. She said the harness had been broken for a long time and that it seemed it had been bothering him for just as long. He said it had. She said she was glad it was done. She said it quietly, looking at the fire, and he stood there in the doorway and felt something he recognized but hadn't expected to feel again, not for a long time. And he didn't say anything about it. It was too new to say anything about. The last week of January brought fresh snow, 3 more inches on top of the old, and then the 1st of February came in with a cold, clear run of days, the kind where the sky is brilliant and empty, and everything on the ground is frozen hard. The trails north were still closed. She was still here. On the 5th of February, he was in the barn at midday when he heard Barlow spooked hard in his stall, a sound Jonah had learned to trust the way you trust a dog's bark. He came out of the barn with the rifle already in his hand. 4 riders, unfamiliar horses coming down from the north trail at a pace that wasn't cautious. He knew, the way you know a certain kind of trouble before it has a name, that these weren't her people. He was right. They were part of a rustler crew that had been working the Basin all winter, picking off isolated ranchers the way a hard winter always brings out that kind of operation. Men who understood that snowbound country means no help coming and no witnesses. They'd taken cattle from 2 ranches east of him in December. He'd heard about it in town in early January, before the trails closed. The one in front was big, wide in the shoulders, riding a raw-boned brown horse that looked like it hadn't been fed enough. He said something about Jonah being alone out here, and he said it in the particular cheerful way that means the man saying it already knows the answer and finds the answer amusing. Jonah said he was going to need them to turn around. The man laughed. The next few minutes went hard. Jonah got behind the water trough before they fully spread out, which was luck more than skill, and the first shot that came his way took a chip out of the trough rim and hit him in the cheek with a piece of wood. Not deep, but enough to sting and bleed. He returned fire and heard a shout from somewhere to his left. One of them had gotten around behind the barn. Then Sika came out of the cabin with the rifle he kept over the fireplace and the knife, and she didn't shout or announce herself. She just moved to the east corner of the barn and shot the man who'd gotten behind it. Not fatally, in the arm, but the man dropped and screamed, which changed the arithmetic for the others, and then, from the east ridge, came the sound of Apache horses coming down fast. He found out later that her people had been watching the basin for days, following the rustler's movements the way they'd been following a wolf pack of a different kind. Her father, Chato, had sent 4 of his best men to the high ground above Jonah's ranch 2 days before, because Sika had told him what kind of man Jonah was, and Chato had decided to make sure the man survived long enough for the trial Chato had in mind. The rustlers, confronted with 5 Apache riders coming off a ridge at speed, made the calculation most men make when the numbers go against them fast, and they ran. One of them dropped a pistol in the snow. The one with the arm wound left a trail of blood across the white ground going north. It was over in less than 4 minutes. Jonah Pike sat on the step of his cabin with a bloody cheek and Sika standing next to him, and when her father rode into the clearing and looked down at the 2 of them from his horse, the first thing Chato said was something in Hindi that Jonah didn't understand. Sika translated it. She said her father wanted to know why the white man was sitting down. Jonah said he was catching his breath. Chato looked at him for a moment, then he looked at his daughter, then he got down from his horse. What followed was not a short conversation. Chato spoke to Sika in Hindi for a while, and Sika answered, and there were long stretches where Jonah had no idea what was being said. He sat on the step and kept quiet and bled a little from the cheek, and waited. Chato was not a small man, as advertised. He was built like the work had been done in layers, and he had a face that took in information without giving much back. He looked at the cabin, at the barn, at the cattle in the low pasture. He looked at the repaired harness on the fence post. He looked at the water trail Jonah had packed down from the spring hole, and he looked at the firewood stacked under the lean-to, and he looked at his daughter's hands, which had calluses on them now from 2 weeks of serious work. Then he looked at Jonah again for a long time. He said something. Sika translated. She said her father wanted to know what Jonah intended. Jonah said he understood it fine. Jonah looked at the ground for a moment. He thought about Clara. He thought about 3 years of blank country he'd come to specifically because it didn't already have someone's shape in it. He thought about coffee left by the fire in the morning. He thought about a harness repaired. Without a word, he thought about 2 people talking at a dying fire about the ones they'd lost. He said he intended to be honest. He said he hadn't expected any of this and he wasn't pretending otherwise. But he said that he would like permission to ask Sika's father the right question at the right time. There was a pause. Sika translated. There was another pause. Then Chato looked at his daughter and said something else, something shorter, and Sika's face did something complicated. She told Jonah that her father said he would come back when the trails opened fully, and that Jonah had until then. Then Chato got back on his horse. Then he looked at Jonah one more time. He said something in need directly to him, not waiting for translation, and then he rode out of the clearing with his men. Jonah asked Sika what he'd said. She was quiet for a moment. Her face was still doing that complicated thing. She said her father had said that a man who fights wolves for a woman he doesn't know is either very brave or very foolish, and that the difference between the two is usually what the woman thinks. Jonah sat with that. Then he asked Sika what she thought. She looked at him for a long moment. The late afternoon light was coming down flat and gold across the basin, catching the snow on the juniper branches, the icicles along the cabin eaves. Her eyes were dark and steady, and whatever she was working out, she worked it out quietly, and he waited. She said she thought he was brave enough. He said that was the best thing anyone had said to him in a long time. She picked up the rifle she'd set against the cabin wall. She looked at it a moment, and then at him. She said he should go clean his face. He laughed. He hadn't laughed like that in a while, open and real from somewhere lower than his chest. He cleaned his face. February came and went. The snow started to loosen in the first week of March. the creek cracking and running again in the afternoons while it still froze at night. And Jonah knew the trails would open before long. He and Sika didn't talk about it directly, but they both knew, and the knowing put a kind of edge on the ordinary days. She showed him the full run of what she'd been doing with the cattle pen, a reinforcement method she'd seen her father use with a pony herd, using stripped juniper poles in the corners to brace against the kind of pressure a wolf pack puts on a fence line. He helped her. They worked side by side in the cold for most of a morning, not saying much, just doing the work. And at the end she stood back and looked at it and said it would hold. He said he thought it would. She said good. Then she said, because she had that quality of saying the thing directly when it needed to be said, that she was going to miss this. He said he knew. He said she didn't have to. She looked at him. He said what he'd been working out how to say for 2 weeks. He said it plainly, because he'd found that plain was the only way that worked with her, and that he respected that in her, and had been trying to be worthy of it. He said he thought she knew what his intentions were. He said he thought she knew what kind of man he was by now, and he thought she'd already decided something about it. He said he didn't know what her father's decision would be, and that whatever it was, he would respect it. He said he was asking to court her properly, by whatever standard her father set. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the afternoon light moved. Then she said that she had known what he intended for some time. He asked what she thought about it. She said she thought her father would come back in 3 weeks, when the Tonto Trail opened fully. He said he knew that. He was asking her what she thought. She looked at the fence they'd just fixed. She looked at the cattle in the low pasture, and the cabin and the juniper dark hills around the basin. She looked at her own hands. She said she thought a woman didn't have to go where she wasn't willing to go. He said he knew that. She said she was telling him she was willing. He stood there in the thawing late afternoon in the Tonto Basin, and something he'd been carrying for 3 years, not all of it, but most of it, the sharpest part, finally let go. He said, "Thank you." She said there was nothing to thank her for. She said she wasn't doing it for him. He said he knew. He said he was thanking her anyway. She allowed that. Chato came back in the last week of March when the Tonto Trail had been passable for 4 days. He came with his wife, whose name was Istawanda, and with an elder of the Sibicu band, a man named Dosala, who was very old and very quiet, and who looked at everything in the cabin and the barn and the pasture with the careful attention of someone who has seen a great many things and is taking inventory. The visit lasted 3 days. On the first day, Jonah fed them and showed them around the ranch, and Chato asked questions about the cattle and the water rights and the distance to the nearest town. These were practical questions, asked by a practical man assessing what his daughter's life would look like, and Jonah answered them as honestly as he could. On the second day, Dosela spoke to Sika for a long time without anyone else present. On the third day, Chato sat with Jonah by the fire, after the women had gone to sleep, and they sat there for a while with a silence between them that was not hostile and not warm. It was the silence of 2 men measuring each other without the words to do it in a shared language, and they did it anyway, the way you can. Chato spoke. Sika, from across the room where she wasn't supposed to be awake, translated quietly. He said that the Sibicu did not give their daughters lightly. He said that the land and the people were bound together, and that a woman who stayed in the white man's country was always going to be walking in 2 directions, and that a man who took such a woman had a responsibility for the trouble that came with that, and that Jonah would face trouble from his own kind as much as from anyone else. Jonah said he understood that. Chato said he wasn't sure a man could understand it until he'd lived it. Jonah said that was probably true. He said he was asking anyway. Chato looked at him for a long time. Then he said something that Sika translated in a voice that was very quiet, and Jonah thought later that she might have been covering something in her own voice, the way you cover something you're not ready to show yet. She said her father said that the wolves at the door of a man's life come in many shapes. He said that some men turn them away and some men run from them, and a very few do something harder. He said the night Jonah fought the pack for a woman he didn't know was a kind of answer to a question he hadn't asked yet. He said he was giving his answer now. He said, yes. It was a simple ceremony, not the kind the white men in the town 10 miles west would have recognized. There were no candles and no congregation and no ring, at least not at first. What there was the juniper smoke from the fire, and Docella's voice low and serious in the ND language, and Istawanda's hands placing something in Sika's hands, a small thing wrapped in deer hide, and Sika placing Jonah's hand flat and setting it on top of hers. He didn't understand the words. He didn't have to. He understood what was happening the way you understand weather or water, not by thinking but by feeling it arrive. Ian Sika stood by the fire in his cabin in the Chato Basin in the last days of March 1884. The Mogollon rim still snow-capped through the window, the basin greening below, and they were married in the way her people married, which was the first way. They would have a courthouse wedding later, in May, in Globe, because Jonah understood the white world's requirements, and because Sika had decided she was going to walk in both directions, if she was going to walk in any direction at all, and she was going to do it on her own terms. She wore her buckskin dress to the courthouse. The clerk looked at her, and then at Jonah, and then at the paper, and he signed the paper because that was what the paper required, and Jonah signed it too. The clerk shook Jonah's hand. Jonah said he was a lucky man. The clerk said he supposed so. Jonah thought he didn't know the half of it. The winters that followed were still hard, the Chato Basin not being the kind of country that goes soft because you found someone to share it with. The wolves came back the next winter, and the one after. There were men from town who made their feelings known about a white rancher and an Apache wife, and those feelings weren't pleasant. There was a hard summer in 1886 when the cattle prices dropped, and they nearly lost the ranch, and a harder one in 1887 when a fence fire got into the south pasture, and they lost 12 head. But Sika was not a woman who panicked, and Jonah was not a man who quit, and those two things together turned out to be enough. She brought her mother's juniper berry recipe for the winter windburn and used it on the baby's cheeks. When the baby came, a boy they named Chato, which made Chato himself very quiet for a moment, and then very pleased in a way he didn't show but that everyone could see anyway. She taught the boy ND from the day he could understand language, and she taught him English too, and when he was old enough, she started teaching him to ride the way she'd taught her brother, patient and serious, and expecting a lot. Jonah taught him to fix a fence and read the cattle's mood, and not to gamble in town, which Jonah himself had been known to do, before he had something better to do with his evenings. The cabin got a second room in 1886, added on the south side where the light was better, and the barn got a real roof in 1888. Lumber hauled up from Globe on Jonah's wagon over 2 hard trips. Sika's people camped on the East Ridge every winter, on their way between the summer and winter grounds, and every year Chato came down to the cabin for one evening, and he and Jonah sat by the fire and didn't talk very much, and understood each other reasonably well. The harness, the one she'd repaired with juniper bark and dried grass in the 3rd week they'd known each other, held for 7 years before Jonah finally replaced it. He kept the old one in the barn. He wasn't sure why. He just didn't throw it away, she asked him once, a few years on, why he'd come out with the rifle that January night. She asked it matter-of-factly, just curious, the way she asked everything. He thought about it. He said he'd heard the wolves and he'd gone out to check on his cattle, and then he'd seen her, and that was that. She said that wasn't really an answer. He said he supposed it wasn't. He said he guessed he was just a man who didn't like wolves. She said she knew that. She said she was asking why he'd stayed once he'd seen her, why he hadn't scared off the pack and walked away. He sat with that for a moment. He said he didn't know. He said some things you do before you think about them, and then you spend the rest of your time being glad you did. She looked at him in that steady way she had. She said that was a better answer. He said he'd had a long time to work on it. Outside the window, the Chato Basin stretched away to the south, the juniper hills going blue in the late afternoon, the creek catching the light along its winter-cleared banks. Inside the fire was low and the room was warm, and 2 people who'd come from entirely different directions sat beside each other in the ordinary quiet of an ordinary evening, which is the rarest thing there is. And the wolves at the door had not come back, not that night, not for a long while.